Okay, so I think it's probably a good time to begin. Um, I am Professor Alan Walks at the University of Toronto. I always start my classes, each one I begin by um, talking a little bit about myself. My claim to fame is that my name is a sentence. It's a grammatically correct sentence. Um, and I always tell my students that it's a very fitting one because I love to walk. I love to walk around cities and take photos and that kind of thing and interview people. And I've been doing that for a long time. I've been at the University of Toronto since, as a faculty member since when was it? 2004, sorry. I'm thinking even previous century. Um, I also tell my students that my name really should have been Alan Walks and Bikes because I love to bike around cities as well as walk. Um, but alas, my name is just Alan Walks. Anyway, so I'm a professor of geography and planning at the University of Toronto, and myself and a colleague, Dr. Susanna Bunce, are co-directing the Affordable Housing Challenge project at the University of Toronto, which is a project of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. And we've been doing this since right before the pandemic began. The pandemic, of course, we had basically a whole year of public panels, in-person public panels, and then the pandemic kind of forced us to move online, and we've held since then a large number of successful public panels on various topics related to housing. And today we're going to be talking about multiple property ownership and investors, and as an underexplored driver of Ontario's and indeed Canada's housing affordability crisis. This is a topic that is on many people's minds. I have this strange experience now when I'm walking around Toronto or anywhere I am in Canada, and invariably people in front or behind, if I'm on the streetcar or something, people will be talking about housing, and how crazy the housing situation is, how dire it is for renters, how expensive it is, and with kind of a bewilderment about what could possibly be driving the crazy prices and rents that we've seen in our cities, and producing this affordability crisis. So people are looking for answers, and there's been a whole host of attempts to answer this. And one of the best explainers of our crisis has been the role of speculators who can get hold of very cheap loans and access multiple properties and have been buying up properties. And with the idea of renting them out, flipping them, and this kind of thing. And because they have the ability to access those loans, higher amounts of those loans, because they have collateral, they're speculators who already own existing property, they can often outbid others. And so that's been a really big issue. Now, there's been lots of other explainers of this housing affordability crisis. We're going to be hearing a panel talk in depth about the issues. Of course, we have a provincial government here in Ontario, the Ford government, which has focused on housing supply and allowing developers an easier set of laws. They're changing the planning regulations and zoning and everything else to allow developers to build more supply more quickly, with the idea that we'll build 1.5 million homes in 10 years, which is something that we actually have not really ever done. So can we even do it is one of the questions. This focus on supply has an implicit assumption, often made explicit, that our affordability crisis is due to a lack of supply. Those who have been studying the role of speculators in bidding up the prices of land and housing in general have pointed to ways that argument on supply may not actually help explain the dire situation that we're in. when it comes to Toronto's and Canada's housing crisis. So that's the basic context. We have four great panelists today that will be speaking on this issue. Tsahai Carter, who is a policy analyst at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat and a Doctor of Jurisprudence candidate in the Faculty of Law at University of Toronto. We have Jeremy Withers, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto in Geography and Planning, and who has been studying this topic empirically and has some data to show. Steve Pomeroy, who is currently an executive advisor to various provincial housing ministries and municipalities, is a former chair of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, former planner and policy analyst for CMHC, and is currently industry professor with the Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative at McMaster University. And we also have Jessica Bell, who is the MPP for University-Rosedale and the NDP critic for housing policy, as well as being a co-founder and director of TTC Riders and other organizations. Okay, so with that introduction, that's our panel. And I'm not going to spend too much more time with introductions. We're going to hand it over to the panel. I'm going to ask each of the panelists in that order that I just presented to introduce themselves, to talk about the issue of multi-property ownership, and particularly to outline for the audience why this is an issue and what is happening and why we might be concerned. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tsahai.
Thank you. I will go ahead and get my screen sharing started here. So good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you here today. Just bear with me for one moment while I get this started. Mentioned, my name is Tsahai, and I am based currently in the city of Toronto. I am currently a policy analyst for the federal government, but I'm here today as an individual, not representing federal public service at all. So this research, I guess to give some context, I completed some research on housing as part of an internship with Urban Alliance on race relations, where I worked with the Broadbent Institute. And I was given an opportunity to really dig into some policies in an area that I was very concerned with, and I think everyone's very concerned with right now, and that's housing. As a recent graduate and as someone who moved to Toronto to be closer to family, housing has been top of mind. And I know this is the same for everyone here and people across Canada and across the globe, really. So conversations about housing, about the housing crisis have been ongoing for quite some time. And as it's already been mentioned, a lot of the conversation has been focused around construction. I believe this is important, and I'm not here to necessarily say that we shouldn't build or that we don't need more housing. But one thing that confused me looking around my community, I moved from Markham to Etobicoke, specifically Humber Bay Shores, where construction is happening quite rapidly, is that if there's all this construction, why are housing prices still so high? And even living here in Humber Bay Shores, it's lucky that we're in the evening, or else you could hear the construction of another high-rise condo tower that's going up. And considering that a lot of this ongoing construction is for units that are for sale and not for rentals, I'm wondering who's able to buy these properties at such high prices? Who has access and who is benefiting from the sale and construction of these units? So as we think about building more housing and the housing crisis in general, I think it's really important to consider what is being built and for whom. So while there have been extensive discussions on the need to change zoning policies and increase densities, which I believe are important, I saw this as kind of a missing angle that I could dig into. This was not an entirely new topic. There's been conversations on the financialization of housing from the UN, flagging that internationally, Canadian organizations such as the Shift, and StatScan has begun to share data on residential real estate investment. So as this groundwork about this real estate investment has been laid, I wanted to look into potential policy solutions to create more affordable housing for Ontarians. Obviously, this is an extremely complex issue. This involves multiple levels of government and many different considerations. In my research, the paper I published with Broadbent, and this presentation will not cover all of that. The focus will really be on investment, multi-property ownership, and policy actions that can be taken at a provincial and possibly local level. So with this in mind, we kind of use different terms, investor, multi-property owner, and I think it's important to define this. There's different types of homeowners. Non-investors are those who own one home and that is their primary residence. We have investor occupants who own one residence that could be a triplex where they live in one unit and rent out the other two, or it could be perhaps just a home where they rent out their basement. And there's also investors, which we probably refer to as multi-property owners, who own at least one property that's not used as their primary residence. And I was particularly concerned with investors and multi-property owners who own a second property or a third or a fourth with the intention of making a profit. I believe that making this distinction is really important because while residential real estate being used purely as an investment vehicle is a concern, it should also be acknowledged that homeownership in the North American context has a lot of cultural significance and financial significance in terms of providing not just a home, but also financial stability and a safe and secure investment. So it's important that we distinguish who benefits from housing, the different uses that it may have, its principal uses, and who we're trying to support and who needs access to housing. With all of this in mind, I believe that there's a need to rethink housing in Ontario right now. Over time, with low interest rates, housing became a really great investment for people. Following financial crises, it might have seemed more safe in the stock market or trusting your bank. It was relatively easy to purchase and provided great returns. But this has meant that housing has become more of an investment than a place to live and is creating access issues for those who need just somewhere to live that is affordable and safe. Housing needs to be provided and protected as a right. And this means that making sure that housing is most accessible to those in need of a residence rather than to investors. So as the Ontario government begins to undertake the task of addressing housing affordability in the province, it's important to consider who we're providing access to in both long-term and short-term change. To relieve the current housing crisis, I believe that there's a need to take immediate action to curb real estate investment and limit the negative impacts of existing investors. But that by itself may not be enough. I think there's also a need to consider longer-term solutions that don't necessarily rely on for-profit actors to provide affordable housing. When it comes to thinking through these policy solutions, what's great is that we don't have to start from scratch. As I did my research, what was really important for me was looking across Canada and across the globe at different jurisdictions and different levels to see what's already been done, what's working and what's not working, exploring different options and seeing how that can be tailored to a local context, to the Ontario context. So the measures that I'm about to discuss often come from different areas. So to begin, the report addresses three main policy areas where immediate action can be taken to reduce the negative impacts of real estate investment. That first area being tax policy, expanding taxes on investors to include domestic individuals and corporations purchasing properties that they will not be using as a residence. Previously, there was a foreign buyers tax, which eventually led to the foreign buyer ban. But the idea is that for those who are not using this residence, they should be paying more than someone who's looking for somewhere to live. Obviously, the foreign buyer tax was quite popular, and placing these same taxes on domestic investors might be a bit more of a challenge, but realistically, foreign investors do not make up the lion's share of multi-property owners in Ontario. That's something really important to consider. These type of taxes can discourage new purchases, but also potentially leverage like property taxes to fund social housing and make more units available and affordable. This can be for individuals looking to purchase primary residence, or for co-ops or nonprofits who can purchase units and convert those into affordable rental units without a profit incentive. A second area is vacant home taxes. I won't spend too much time on this one because they have been explored and implemented quite a bit. Their effectiveness is sometimes debated, but what they can be done is they can be used in conjunction with other policies to ensure that we're maximizing our housing supply. Finally, there's rent control. Rent control has been a very important tool in Ontario to protect affordability. It has gone a long way making sure that people can stay in their homes when they're renting them, but we can do more. Rent control can be expanded to cover new units, and it can also be tied to units rather than to tenants, so that rent prices aren't jacked up after tenants leave, and landlords don't have an incentive to push tenants out so that they can increase rents. What is interesting about these policies, and while I believe they can be really effective, is that they're temporary. We've seen this with rent control in Ontario already, where this has been weakened, is that they might be effective for a period of time, but there's no guarantee of their long-term continuation. As long as the profit incentive remains, and if there's ever a chance that interest rates go back down, the profits that can be made from housing might outweigh the benefits of these tax policies. And for that reason, I think there's a need to consider other models of housing. And specifically, a need to consider expanding social housing. So social housing or public housing has very negative connotations in North America. It's known for being unlivable, known for being poor and dirty. And this is partly tied to classism and racism and other forms of bias, but it's also a reflection of underfunding and often poor management of social housing. But social housing doesn't have to be a bad thing. At its most basic definition, social housing is simply housing that is owned publicly or cooperatively and is not designed to make a profit. That can be a really great thing if it's done correctly. Expanding or changing social housing in Ontario will require a lot of work. It will require countering negative perceptions, designing and providing high quality units that people want to take care of and people want to live in, building housing in accessible, walkable neighborhoods, and giving residents a stake in their units or buildings. Once again, we don't have to start from scratch. We can look at a lot of models across the globe. One major model is in Singapore, where over 80% of residents live in social housing units. And one thing that's really interesting about the Singaporean model is that this model also gives tenants a say in their housing and a chance to invest their money in their housing and grow their wealth, not to a large degree. That being said, there's a lot of limits to the Singaporean model that should be considered in an Ontario context. Different perceptions of democracy, of culture, and of relationships with the government and the public mean that it's not necessarily easily adaptable to the Ontario context. But there's still things that we can learn from that model. A more adaptable model might be in Vienna, Austria, where more than 60% of residents live in city-built, sponsored, or managed housing. This model is especially great because it shows us that social housing is not one thing. There are government-owned and managed properties, cooperatives, and properties managed by nonprofits. One thing that's really interesting and is already working in Ontario in a lot of contexts is cooperatives, where it might be managed by a non-for-profit, and different tenants with different wealth levels might pay different amounts of money to live in these properties. And they're more affordable and often known as being really great housing solutions when they're managed well. But we can start creating social housing using taxes leveraged on multi-property owners or units that are vacated as taxes are applied to start building new models. This will not be easy, but we know that it can be done. In Vienna, Austria, there is a great example of how it can be done. Moving on, housing is for everyone. There is no single solution to create affordable housing in Ontario. However, tackling the financialization of housing is crucial for creating a financially sustainable housing system. When I talk about these policy options, social housing, tax policies, vacant homes taxes, I imagine these all working together. It's not one or the other, it's and. We need to start taking action immediately to bring down prices, but also look towards creating more longer-term solutions to ensure affordability over time. It won't be easy, but we can start somewhere. I'll leave it there for now, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and continuing on with our discussion.
Super. Thanks so much for that great introductory presentation, Tsahai.
Thank you.
So now we will move on to our next presenter. Jeremy Withers, University of Toronto, will be presenting some empirical research on investor ownership. Jeremy.
Hi, everyone. Is my screen in presentation mode right now? No, it's not. Okay. I want it to be in presentation mode, but for me still to be able to read notes. So it might have to be out of presentation mode unless, yeah.
You actually did put it in for a brief
Yeah,
moment
but
there. Jim.
then my screen goes full and I can't read my notes, which unfortunately I'm not gonna, what would be bad. So we'll leave it like this for now. Hi everyone, my name is Jeremy Withers. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Planning here at University of Toronto. And I'm also the outreach coordinator for the Affordable Housing Challenge project at the University of Toronto School of Cities, and was the main organizer of this event. And the reason I wanted to organize it is to help grow a conversation to address the quite dramatic changes that we've seen over the past decade in terms of the rising concentration of ownership of housing in Toronto and across Ontario. So by housing investors, I mean buyers who already own property and are buying up additional housing to expand their portfolios. This is a relatively small group, which today represents 8% of Canada's population. And over the past 10 years, these investors have seen a sharp uptick in their appetite for buying housing, but more importantly, in their ability to do so. And that's because, and Steve Pomeroy is really going to go into this a lot more, but that's because as house prices have risen, owners who've seen their wealth climb have become empowered and inclined to leverage that existing portfolio of housing, along with their substantially higher than average incomes, to successfully outbid prospective first-time buyers. So as we'll see over the past, as we'll see, investors have increasingly displaced first-time buyers as the largest buyer group for both condos and non-condos, doubling their share of purchases of all housing put up for sale annually across Ontario. Condo apartments, which have long provided starter homes to urban residents, have been especially targeted. And this small group of investors has more than tripled their ownership of those units in Toronto since 2010, and are on track to own. They're on track to substantially further expand their share of ownership. So these are major changes to our housing system that are underway, and certainly recently they've been a topic of growing concern. Over the course of the pandemic, there's been a growing recognition that investors are leading to price escalation. This is something that the Bank of Canada has put out reports and announcements on. There's been a lively discussion over the financial risks that these investors pose, as they're typically much more leveraged and indebted, and more likely to sell off their properties en masse in an adverse environment. And these are concerns that are grounded not just in theory, but in extensive research in many countries, which document investors' contribution to price inflation and also their destabilizing effects, quite famously on the US housing system in the lead up to the global financial crisis. One second. And yet, in spite of these growing concerns, the response of policymakers has so far been quite short-sighted. On the one hand, we've certainly seen some strong words and policies directed at housing investors, though really only those who don't happen to have a Canadian passport. We really do lack a serious discussion of the fact that it's local investors who own the vast majority of investment properties, with foreigners owning less than 20% of investment properties in Ontario. Nor do we often talk about the fact that unless these regulations on foreign buyers are extended to apply to local investors as well, it's likely these local investors who are going to be the main beneficiaries of these restrictions. And that's something that the data I'm going to show, I think, will help clarify. But when the focus turns to addressing the increase of investment properties in general, most policymakers' reaction continues to be indifference. And this complacency is typically cloaked in the argument that investor demand really just represents a momentary blip. Like it's really a symptom of the fact that markets are already tight and overheated, As the head of the OSFI put it 2 years ago, investors are just trying to get in on the action, and it's a free market, so more power to them. From this perspective, any talk of addressing local investors is really just missing the big picture. It's a distraction because what we actually need to do is to respond to the growing demand by building more supply. This is a very common response. And I'd say it's a very ideological response and really forces discussion into a false dichotomy. What it asks us to do, and I see this on Twitter all the time. This is a very common response. What it asks us to do is to choose between one of two paths. Do we implement supply side planning reforms to respond to this heated demand, which is increasingly coming from a small group of wealthy investors? Or do we implement demand side reforms to help weed out some of this demand that's increasingly coming from wealthy investors? And why it's assumed we can't work on both at the same time, I think is truly confusing. And so in this presentation, I want to start by, I want to step back from these arguments and kind of provide some data tracking the growing concentration of investor ownership. And I want to argue that far from representing an incidental symptom of our crisis of affordability, the rise of investor ownership is an important factor contributing to it. And that's true whether we're talking about the escalating price of home ownership, which is being pushed out of reach of the vast majority of non-owners, the declining rates of home ownership and the surge in the number of higher income residents who are being crowded into a relentlessly low vacancy rental market. And at the same time, I want to argue it's an important factor contributing to the low levels of purpose-built rental construction as these developments continue to have trouble competing with condo developments. And finally, it has to do with the declining security of tenure throughout the rental system, as purpose-built rental is in the process of being replaced as the main source of rental housing by condos, where it's far easier to evict tenants and far harder for tenants to organize to defend and expand their rights. So outlining how these trends have evolved and accelerated, I want to argue that in the absence of strong policy response, they're likely to intensify. So I'm just going to begin, tracking the rising concentration, outlining where and how it's growing, then looking at who these investors are, and then looking at what type of housing they're buying up. So starting with transactions data. So TerraNet is a company that operates the province's land registry data. And it reports that in 2011, home buyers with multiple properties purchased just under a sixth of all homes sold in Ontario. By 2021, their share had risen to a quarter. And by the end of 2022, they reached 28%. So TerraNet also distinguishes between purchases of condo and non-condo housing. That distinction is not pictured here. But the they report that while investor demand for non-condo housing is clearly growing, since 2020, it's risen from a fifth to a quarter of all non-condo unit purchases. Condos continue to be the major focus. And this is really important to sit with because condos, as we know, are typically by far the most affordable housing for sale and have historically provided starter homes for many urban residents. So looking at condo-specific data, TerraNet reports that over the past 2 years across Ontario, investors' share of all condos purchased rose from 29% to a record-breaking 36%. And that's in Q4 2022, the most recent data available. And at the same time, first-time buyers experienced a proportionate decline, going from 31% to 24% of all condo purchases. So clearly, investor demand for housing is not a passing blip. It's a long-term trend extending over a decade, and it also appears to be accelerating, for the moment at least, despite the end of lockdown measures and despite so far the substantial rise in interest rates experienced since the spring of 2022. So this is data on transactions. This is flow data. But to what extent has this growing dominance in the sales room of investors translated into a growing concentration of ownership of the housing stock? So a number of recent data sets released by StatsCan and CMHC can help to clarify that. Since 2011, the census has tracked the number of condo units and houses that are rented. This provides an initial conservative estimate of the growing stock of investment properties. So between 2011 and 2021, across Ontario, the share of all condo units rented out rose from just under a quarter to a third, and the total number rented doubled. Over this same period, the share of all houses, that's single semi-detached row houses that were rented out, rose from about a tenth to just under a seventh. So if we want to zoom in for kind of a more detailed look about how these trends are emerging, on an urban level, CMHC's annual rental market reports have since 2006 tracked the number of condo apartment units that are rented. That's the vast majority of the condo stock in the city of Toronto. Again, we see that the share of units owned by investors and rented out has really climbed since 2010. It's nearly doubled across suburban regions of the GTA, across the city of Toronto, and in its center. It's doubled in all these areas. And so in the city of Toronto, in the former city of Toronto, we see that it's almost surpassed half of all condo apartment units that are owned by investors and rented out. And so while data from CMHC and the census each confirm that this concentration has increased substantially, it's important to recognize they only provide a conservative and incomplete estimate. And that's because they only account for non-owner occupied units that are being rented out at the time of the survey. And so they neglect, any that are vacant or rented short-term through, platforms like Airbnb. And to this end, there's quite a useful data set that's been released actually in February by StatsCan through the Canada Housing Statistics Program, which helps fill some of these gaps. And that does so by drawing on property tax records and other filings to give a pretty detailed snapshot. But this detailed snapshot is as of early 2020. And this is the data set to which Tsahai's presentation was referring. So when it was released in February, it actually drew a lot of headlines for its finding that Ontario had more investment properties than any other province, which accounted for 42% of all condo apartment units and 15% of all houses. In the city of Toronto, the share was 40% and 13% of houses, respectively. Whereas in the suburban regions of Toronto, the Greater Toronto area, it was 35% and 11%. So it's important to remember that this is a snapshot. It's taken right before the pandemic began. And so as we've seen from transaction data and through CMHC, the numbers are likely much higher now. But beyond identifying the scale of ownership, this Canadian Housing Statistics Program data also provides insights into who these investors are and the type of properties they're buying up. So as of 2020 in Ontario, individual investors owned a little over 2/3 of investment condo apartment units and 87% of investment houses. Investors have an average income of $95,000, which is, almost 50% higher than the average income of owners owners that don't have investment property, and, substantially higher than the average income of a household who doesn't yet own a home, i.e. a tenant. Interestingly, businesses own the remaining just under a third of investment condo apartment units and 13% of investment houses. 96% of these units that are owned by businesses are owned by corporations, with the remainder owned through a range of different legal types. It's a little difficult to understand the difference between these businesses. There's not a lot of great data on it. I understand that many of these corporations are simply formed by individuals to hold their portfolios in, and that's for tax reasons. And others are larger, often institutional investors who are buying blocks of condos and renting them out. it'd be really interesting to know more, to have more research on this. So beyond revealing who owns these investment properties, this data also reveals what types of properties are being targeted by investors. And this is really important. Across Ontario, the more recently a housing unit was built, the more likely it is to be owned as an investment property. So in the Greater Toronto area, we can see that this pattern is especially decisive here. With condo units built over the 2010s, 50% more likely to be investment properties than those built in the 2000s, and twice as likely to be investment properties as those built before 2000. It's a really sharp and decisive trend. And one question this raises is whether investors are mainly buying new properties, but then selling them on to owner-occupiers after holding them for a few years. This is something that we often hear from developers who are quite okay with investors buying these properties, and it's a type of filtering in their mind. And so I looked into this, and we can answer that question by returning to census data on rental condos and asking whether the concentration of ownership has decreased over time, depending on when the units were built. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the clear evidence of an overall increase in investor ownership, the concentration of investment ownership has risen for every single period built. So in some cases, the increase was substantial, in others it was minimal, but no matter the age of the unit, investors bought more than they sold, bidding up the price and crowding out prospective homeowners. So altogether, these findings alert us to some pretty alarming implications about how our housing system is in the process of being reshaped. First off, it has to be said that this data raises serious doubts about the ability of the province's recent raft of developer-friendly planning and tax reforms to achieve their stated goal of making homeownership more attainable. So since taking office in 2018, Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives have put forward a dizzying number of policies presented as making it cheaper and faster for private developers to build in more areas. Through doing so, their goal is to spur the private development of 1.5 million new quote-unquote attainable homes by 2030. So these policies have been rightly criticized for rolling back the already limited powers of municipalities and conservation authorities to actually steer the type of housing being developed, to make sure it's more responsive to unmet local needs. They've also been rightly criticized for including no mechanisms with which to ensure these tax breaks and cost savings are actually passed on to home buyers, rather than just being padded on to the real estate sector's profit margins. To these, we can now add a pretty damning observation, which is that in the absence of new regulations, it's probable that the majority of new homes, in the city of Toronto at least, will end up being attained by investors. I really don't want to stop our discussion there, although that would be, a clean segue to the end, because this issue is certainly also one that's not just affecting, high-income tenants locked out of homeownership. That's one part of the story. I think the bigger story is the effect this is all having on our rental system, which, as always, is leaving lower-income communities most affected. So many investors, including our federal housing minister, Ahmed Hassan, like to celebrate their housing portfolios as simply contributing to rental supply. But the effects are more insidious. And that's because when an investor succeeds in purchasing a housing unit for their portfolio, they've also succeeded in outbidding a prospective homeowner. As more and more have done so over the past decade, it's contributed to a flood of higher income residents who are crowded into a persistently low vacancy rental market. At the same time, even as the number of renters have surged, very little new purpose-built rental housing has been developed. Certainly there's been an uptick in recent years, but compared to condo production, it remains minimal. And that too, I want to argue, is in no small part due to how challenging it remains for purpose-built development to compete with condo developments, both in terms of simply trying to bid on suitable sites to develop, but also as a business proposition. The fact is, it's more lucrative to sell new condo units predominantly to wealthy housing investors, as we've seen, than it is to rent them long-term to tenants. So as condo rental edges towards being replaced as condo rental edges towards replacing purpose-built rental as the main source of rental housing in Toronto, it's leading to a rental supply dominated by tiny and low security of tenure units. Tenants in condos are far easier to evict than tenants in purpose-built rental. In fact, well over half of evictions across Canada occur because a landlord claims their unit for use or claims they're going to sell it because they claim or has sold it. But finally, these changes aren't just affecting condo tenants. As we all know, this influx of high-income renters that's coming in as the rate of home ownership is declining is also contributing to aggressive displacement pressures for lower-income communities. As large investors are increasingly buying up aging purpose-built rental stock with the goal of either kind of repositioning these buildings to attract higher-income renters or to redevelop them as condos. And this latter displacement pressure is likely to become a much bigger issue in the coming years if the province moves forwards with their much discussed plan to override municipalities' rental replacement policies. So stepping back from all this data, we can say that if the trends experienced over the past decade are allowed to continue, in 10 years, Ontario's housing system will have changed enormously. Across Ontario, over half of all homes put up for sale annually will be bought up by investors. Nearly half of all condo units will be owned as investment properties. In the city of Toronto, 2/3 of all condo apartment units will be owned as investment properties. And condo rentals will have replaced purpose-built as the main source of housing for tenants. This future is not inevitable, but without strong new regulations and taxes to discourage this mounting concentration of ownership, it does appear likely. So what should be done? I'm sure we'll all be discussing this a bunch more. The policy options appear fairly straightforward. Either the province or the federal government could extend the taxes that foreign investors must pay when purchasing units to local investors. They could extend these to local investors as well. And this would discourage them from outbidding prospective homeowners. Furthermore, if the province wanted to leave these policies to the discretion of municipalities, they can empower those which chose to add an additional land transfer tax to buyers with multiple properties. Also likely effective would be for the federal government to increase the capital gains tax on the windfalls investors make when selling non-primary residences. And if the timing of the phase-in was planned carefully, it could lead to many homes becoming available for purchase, reducing the price of housing, and raising a lot of revenues, which could be dedicated towards building more nonprofit co-op housing. Importantly, these policies would also help level the playing field for a renaissance of purpose-built rental development in Ontario. In this context, much could be gained from government playing a stronger role in supporting nonprofits and co-ops in the construction of these units through proactive planning reforms, such as of right, high-density approvals for nonprofits and financial support, of course. So with this in mind, it's really heartening to see, leading mayoral candidates right now putting center stage the call for initiatives like that. In terms of ensuring that new supply is more responsive to the wide range of unmet needs in our city, this approach is clearly miles away from our current practice of letting wealthy condo investors provide unstable and unaffordable rental housing. So thanks a lot, everyone, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so we're going to move on now to our distinguished guest, Steve Pomeroy, who has decades of experience analyzing Canada's housing system. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alan. So I'm going to sort of broaden up the discussion a little bit to talk about the bigger, sort of the background context of why we're seeing excessive increases in home prices and rents, but then try to come back to, I'm just trying to get this go to full screen here, back to the issue of the
It looks like full screen to us, by the way, Steve.
Sorry?
On my end, it's full screen. Oh, there you go. Okay.
To the investor buyer. And I think implicit in both the framing of this discussion and the two presentations by Tsahai and Jeremy, there's a bit of a vexing question in here in terms of the implication is that the expansion of these multiple property owners is a bad thing. And that then raises the question is, can we actually identify a preferred, nice, benign, good set of landlords and investors versus bad ones? And can policy dissuade the bad ones and encourage the good ones? I think that's, I'll leave that one on the table for us to come back to, because I think it's a challenging kind of a question. Yeah, and the other reality is, if we're going to have, if we want a rental sector, we need investors. We need somebody to actually invest in property that they become a landlord and we rent out to somebody else. As we're having this conversation here, there are conversations happening on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, where the Humour Committee is undertaking hearings on the financialization of rental, and there are certain submissions that have suggested that the government needs to tax and regulate away the existence of REITs. So if we get rid of individual investors, we get rid of REITs, we get rid of all investors in the extreme. I mean, I think we need to think about what's the consequence in the extreme of that actually happening. So just to go back to the beginning of this, and Alan said at the beginning, the ready acceptance that we are in an housing affordability crisis, defined as young kids can't afford to buy a house, and rents are excessively expensive. I mean, I think a lot of the rhetoric around this has very much fixated on the sort of the diagnosis of the problem is the primary cause of excessive pricing and rent increases is the lack of supply. And I would argue that I think that's a very narrow and incorrect interpretation of what has actually caused prices to go up. And I think the evidence shows us that we in fact don't have a chronic undersupply, except in some locales and some regions, particularly the old city of Toronto, and it's not a chronic long-term effect; it's a more recent effect. And I think the data shows quite clearly that is in fact the case. If we think about affordability and what causes prices to go up, there are two sets of factors. What's the quantity? How many people are out there demanding housing relative to the number of homes we're building? So that's the quantity of demand versus the responsive supply. And the second is the quality of the ability of those purchasers to actually demand and exert pressure on prices. So that's what are their incomes? What's the cost of money? And low interest rates stretch the impact of a dollar further and allow people to bid things higher. And also, as Alan or Jeremy mentioned, the accumulated wealth that people actually have from having owned a home for a number of years, and appreciation begets more appreciation. So the folks that are selling are coming to the transaction with bags of money, to put it bluntly. In terms of the quantity of demand, what we've really seen, we were essentially growing at around about 350,000 people a year for most of this millennium, until around about 15, 16. And all of a sudden that bumped up mainly because of immigration, and a particular type of immigration identified here as non-permanent residents. These would be temporary foreign workers and international students. Most post-secondary institutions and colleges and educational organizations have very, very actively recruited the international student, because the university grants are frozen, domestic tuition fees are frozen. The only variable that universities have to raise more money is to get more international students, where they can generate much more significant revenues. Last year, we issued 620,000 international student visas in this country. Students rent, temporary foreign workers rent. So there's a very, very big impact on the rental market as a consequence of that pattern of immigration. And we spend a lot of time talking about how many new permanent residents we're going to allow in with new immigration targets. We spend very little time talking about the impact of these non-permanent residents that are much, much larger than the group of permanent residents. So in terms of the argument about when, the problem is a lack of supply, when we actually look at how many homes we need to meet population growth over the last 10 years or so, if we take if every 1,000 people that the population grows by, the average household size in Canada in 2016 was 2.45 people per home. Divide 1,000 by 2.45 people and you figure out how many homes you need. And what you can see here is that the blue line shows how many we would require at that ratio, and the orange line shows how many we completed. And give or take some inconsistencies from year to year, generally speaking, they have tracked together very, very well. So which suggests it's not a serious problem. We have seen obviously some big changes in 2020 when we had practically nobody coming in because we closed the borders. Clearly, we saw the number of homes required went down dramatically because very few thousands of people were coming in while we continued to compete. And subsequently, as migration has substantially increased in 21-22, we of course see that we do actually have a bit of a shortfall in that particular 1 year period. To sort of smooth things out a little bit, using a 3-year moving average of both completions of homes, or in this case I use starts, home starts versus population growth, again looking at population growth per 1,000 and 2.45 people per household. What we really see is, because we have a media that's focused on Toronto, and Toronto thinks it's the center of the universe, and I can say that as someone that's not sitting in Toronto, the media think this is a national problem. This is a Toronto problem. The rest of the country is doing just fine. At the number of houses we need, the dotted line, we need 416 homes for every 1,000 new people we have in our population, and we've nationally exceeded that pretty well every single year. The place that has chronically under provided is Toronto, the Toronto CMA, which is distinct from the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, which has come closer to matching the national pattern than Toronto has. So this is very much a Toronto problem. The question as to whether supply by itself, by simply creating many more units, will address the affordability issue. I mean, there's some basic microeconomics in there that a basic supply-demand curve. If you increase supply, a price will come down. Well, housing's unique. It's fixed in location. It has a whole bunch of other attributes. It doesn't operate like the widgets that we read about in our economic textbooks. And the evidence of this is, if we look at Ottawa, for an example, we saw a very, very significant increase in housing starts in Ottawa in 2021, 2021. So compared to the previous decade, we created almost 60% more starts annually in those 2 years than we had in the previous decade. Yet prices continued to go through the roof, no pun intended. And the way the market works is, if there is demand pushing up the price, new builders will be opportunistically taking advantage of that. So when they started building 2 years ago, they might have estimated they could get $540,000. And a year or two later, they find out, well, the price has gone up to $700,000. Are they still going to sell for the $540,000 they originally planned? Or are they opportunistically going to take advantage of where prices are at? So simply flooding the market those new units will come on the market at what the market will bear. And the other part of that is, developers are quite shrewd in reading the tea leaves, and they will look at the absorption rates in terms of how many homes they're selling. And if they think the market is slowing down and they won't be able to sell their units, they won't bother starting to build. And more importantly, lenders won't actually lend them the money to build in the first place until they pre-sell 70% of their units, which is where, of course, investor purchases come in. If we get rid of investor purchases, the developers that we need to add new supply will stall their development because they won't be able to sell enough units to actually get going, and we'll have a shortage of supply, and then there'll be negative consequences from doing that. So a little bit of be careful what you wish for on that one. So I would argue we don't have a chronic shortage of supply, except in Toronto. And while certainly I would agree that in the short term, because housing markets are inherently supply inelastic, people can jump on a plane yesterday and arrive today. We can't put a house on a production line today and have it produced tomorrow. It takes 3 or 4 years to produce that house. So you will have short-term temporary effects as we are now seeing due to significantly rising demand from immigration, that we've just been, it's not so much that we've had chronic shortages of supply, it's just we're not able to accelerate and expand our supply quickly enough to keep up with the very, very short-term shock of this surge in population we've seen in the last few years, which is a very different way of framing the lack of supply argument. So that's the supply side. I personally think that the demand side factors have much more explanatory power over what's happening on prices than do the lack of supply. So basically, this is really where we get into the quality of demand. And what we've seen is a long-term trend of rising household income. And while singles do buy, most homes are purchased by couple income families. Median family income going up by $30,000 over the last 15 years. Same time, interest rates went down. Every dollar of income at lower interest rates stretches you a little bit further. So yes, on the one hand, if one only looks at the price to income ratio of how this divergence between prices and incomes, we see housing is getting unattainable. Simply, incomes simply aren't keeping up with the rate of increase in home prices, which this chart shows us. And clearly that appears to be the case with a price to income ratio going from 4 to 1 to 7 to 1. But what's happening, because nobody buys it, well, very few people buying cash, most real estate purchases and investments are highly leveraged. If we take the prevailing median income in any year and the prevailing mortgage interest rate at 5% mortgage interest rate with a 10% down payment in any year, the gray line here shows us how much money that the average or median household could actually borrow in each of those years. And what we see is the purchasing capacity, the leverage capacity of households has exceeded the average price throughout that entire period until 2021. So it's the fact that folks are able to bid higher than the existing average prices, that they are the ones that are pulling the price up. And it really was only in 2021 where we had the quirky circumstances of the 40% increases in 2 years that line finally crossed over, and we got to the point where actually people were no longer able to afford the prices that we were seeing. So we've really got this, the influence of mortgage rates with clear impact. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is when mortgage rates are going down, prices are going up. But when mortgage rates start going back up again, we've seen prices go down in the last year. And I mean, that's a much, because I use annual data here in a particular month, there's a bit of a lag effect. But essentially, we do see the prices coming down when we see that last year there. And so the rise of mortgage rates has had a lot more to do with initially with prices going up, the leverage effect that I just talked about. And now we're obviously seeing the impact with home prices coming down significantly, 10-15% in most markets from the peak in the spring of 2022 to currently. But those prices are still well ahead of where they were in 2020. So in terms of relative affordability, it's improved, but not that much, and certainly access has been suppressed by high mortgage rates. So, as I said, the cause of prices going up, prices don't go up in a vacuum. Consumers pulled them up or drove them up, and it really enabled by the capacity to pay by low interest rates. The other factor here is that most home purchasers are people who already own a home. 3/4 of home purchasers are people that already have a house, and they have actually benefited from the growth in their equity, and they're using that equity to basically go into bidding wars, and they're quite capable of bidding $100,000, $200,000 over asking price, whereas the first-time buyer who's scraping together a down payment really can't have that kind of flexibility, except when their parents are helping them. And the other thing that's happening is, as a result, and Jeremy spoke about this, these massive equity gains that we're seeing, which I'll come back to a bit more in a minute, are really creating, they haven't really created so much a new breed, but they've expanded an existing breed of purchaser, the so-called investor buyer. And these buyers are not buying as long-term landlords who are seeking a cash flow. They are buying solely based on the fact that they look over their shoulder, they see home prices going up double digits, they think this is a great short-term investment, and they're actually, in most cases, not actually covering their mortgage payments, condo fees, and taxes, but they expect to get a very large capital gain as a consequence of flipping and selling the unit in a few years. And when they do so, of course, the tenants in there, as Jeremy described, typically get tossed out, either because they want to just toss them out to sell the unit vacant, and or the new purchaser happens to be an owner occupant that's buying it for themselves. The consequence, of course, is that the security of tenure is much weaker for folks in that particular case. And this whole notion is something I've sort of framed as supercharged demand, as those units, the excess equity that's been created from folks who already own a home. This is some data that's similar to what Jeremy already showed, is the expansion of these small scale investors that have this extra equity, and they're sort of looking around and saying, gee, we got all this money in our house, and we've saved a pile of money by not going on vacation and buying things during COVID. Let's go and buy an investment property. And we do see a very dramatic growth in the number of condo units that are rented nationally. It's gone, 400,000 to 700,000. It's almost a doubling. And in Toronto, pretty significant increases as well. And most of those units are not affordable units. These are units that are renting over $1,500 a month. The investors in these condos are creating some rental supply, which is offsetting what historically was a very low level of rental supply. But it's not having the effect of improving affordability. And the other effect that we're seeing is both the high home prices alongside a whole bunch of what's called macroprudential policies, lending rules, stress tests, mortgage qualifying criteria that CMHC applies on insured loans, have constrained access to home ownership, and that has left demand in the rental market from these erstwhile wannabe buyers who can't actually get into the ownership market, which is exactly the opposite of what we saw in between 1996 and 2006, when the home ownership rate in this country went from 63% to 69% over a 10-year period. That was 800,000 renters moved from being renters to becoming owners, which is the same thing as building 80,000 rental units a year. So even though we were building very little new rental supply in that decade, but it didn't matter because the pressure was coming off the rental market as a result of folks exiting into home ownership. We've now turned off that pressure release valve. Folks are staying in the home ownership market. Their demand is augmented by the demand from these temporary foreign workers and international students to create very, very high demand on rentals at a time when we simply don't have enough rental housing. And the consequence is very, very strong upward pressure on rents and decline in vacancy rates and upward pressure on rents. And it's really the fact that these rents have gone up so much, and we have a rent regulation regime across the country in pretty well all provinces that includes the mechanism of vacancy decontrol. So when the unit is vacated on turnover, you can move the rent up to a whatever the market will bear. And that, to some extent, engenders a behavior that incents landlords to actually try and get rid of long-term tenants who have suppressed rents because they've stayed in there for a number of years, and the in-situ rent control has allowed them to lag the market quite substantially. So it's in a very perverse way, the regulatory environment, along with the market pressures, are causing people to behave in a particularly, I'm not sure if predatory is the right word, but it's certainly not a very socially desirable way, and it certainly is the exact opposite of what the advocates of the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing would say we should be doing with the rental stock. And then the evictions data that Jeremy showed as well. While a lot of the discourse has been about these big bad REITs, it turns out that the folks who are actually much more prevalent in causing evictions are these smaller investors. So this is just showing, I sort of already really mentioned this, but the very, very low levels of rental starts that we had for 20 years, less than 10, a third of us rent, but less than 10% of starts in this period were for rental. And what actually saved the rental market from a massive crisis 15, 20 years ago were two things. One, the exits into ownership that I already spoke about. And secondly, the main form of rental supply from the mid-90s, to current time, has actually been the indirect supply of rental through these investors in condos who then become owners. And I think there's an interesting nuance here internationally, in that Canada is the only country in the world that has created a statistical concept called purpose-built rental housing. Every other country in the world measures the starts of multi-residential buildings, whether you're in Australia, New Zealand, the US, the UK, a number of European countries. They don't distinguish purpose-built rental. Buildings are built and investors of various types buy them, or owner-occupants buy them, and over time those things change. And so it's much more normal in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, to have a very, very large rental market. It's similar in scale to our own. 26-28% of housing in Australia is rented, but the existence of large-scale institutional and corporate landlords is almost completely absent. Almost all of that housing is owned by small-scale landlords doing exactly what we're talking about today as the primary source of rental supply. So we've sort of been sitting in a very sheltered bubble with this concept of purpose-built housing, which really doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Pressure on rents. The interesting thing here is I think we've become much more aware in the last few years of the degree of rent increases on turnover, because historically we've relied on a very, very poor metric of what was going on in the rental market. So the annual CMHC survey of the purpose-built rental market, so 2.1%, just under half of all rental properties in the country, are surveyed every year by CMHC, properties of 3+ units in the purpose-built market, and they tell us what the vacancy rates are and what the rents are. And despite that the lack of construction that I talked about, you can kind of see the vacancy rate there stayed pretty close to the 3% that's identified as a healthy sort of vacancy rate in rental markets, until it went below that 3% around about 2010, and it's been down there for a while ever since, except in the COVID year. And then they also measure the year-to-year increase in rents. But the trouble is that what they're doing is they are reporting the change in the overall average market rent from year to year for the entire housing stock. 80% of the units where people didn't move, and the 20%, give or take, of the units where people did move. So unlike the real estate market, where we see home price data based on transactions, we were actually measuring rental change based on stock. Now, what's happened in the last few years, because of the expansive use of web-based lettings and rent advertising, and the fact that the major companies involved in this, and particularly rentals.ca, now publish on a monthly basis the change in rents of newly tenanted, so the transactions, newly tenanted properties in April of 2023 compared with April of 2022. And now we're actually seeing just the increase on the units that turned over, which is a much more comparable statistic to home sale prices, and a much more useful statistic in terms of making us more aware of what's happening in turnover units. And we're seeing the rental.ca data that's showing 17, 18, 20, 21% yearly increases in the rents. So I think we've just become much more aware as a consequence of that new data source. In the earlier chart there on new rental construction, what we see here is Ontario is lagging the rest of the country, but we have seen a significant increase in new rental starts. Nationally, we were less than 20,000 units a year right through this 20-year period, and have gradually gone up to 40, 60, and then 80,000 units nationally in 2022, which nationally is about 32% of all housing starts. So we actually are getting to where we want to be. So we've had a very strong market response. Because rents were so high, the market has actually responded to that and significantly increased the level of supply. But in doing so, what we're seeing in those new units, this chart is, this is some custom data I got from CMHC, where I asked them to tell me the rents of properties that were built and completed prior to 2016 and those that were completed after 2015. And we see that on average, and certainly in Toronto, you've got rents are, give or take 150% of the average market rent. So the CMHC average market rent, again, is measuring the rents of the existing stock. So it's all the old stuff that we built in the 60s, in the 70s, and that kind of stuff. Whereas the stuff built just since 2015 is obviously the new stuff. And there with that sort of since 2015, we're still picking up units from 6-7 years ago where rents hadn't started to go up quite as much. But obviously, it's 1.5 times the average market rent. So yes, we're getting new construction, and again back to the supply argument. Yes, we're stimulating and we're getting a market response that's creating new supply, but it's absolutely not creating affordable supply. And then the other part of this, which is really, really critically important, is just how fast and how quickly we are actually losing the lower rent stock. Because the census measures in increments of $250 a month, up to 500, 5 to 750, 750 to 1,000, etc. I use the census data over 3 census, 2011 to 2021, to determine how many units we've actually lost that were renting at less than $750 a month. And it was in Ontario almost 100,000 between 2011 and 2016, and 322,000 nationally. I should have updated this with the new data I got from the 2021 census. There's another 230,000 lost between 2016 and 2021, for a total of 550,000 units in the last decade. If you compare that number to the number of units we created under the affordable housing programs that existed between 2011 and 2019, and then the ones that we've implemented under the National Housing Strategy in the last few years, for every new unit we have funded under those 2 sets of programs, we have lost 12 units as a result of this erosionary process. Some of this erosion is actual demolitions, because we have planning policies that favor intensification, and most of our older, more affordable stock tended to be in the older inner city areas that were the areas that we were intensifying. So we're knocking down the old 3- and 4-story walk-ups that were moderately priced rentals and replacing them with high-rise condos or exclusively high rentals. And in other cases, the unit still exists, but the rents, because of vacancy decontrol, have moved well above the 750 level. And in Toronto, actually, I did some data looking at this. The reason that the number went down in 2016, 2021 is because there aren't very many units left below 750. And now we're starting to see the erosion happening in the 750 to 1,000 rent range. And very, very few of those units are now left as well. So it has a massive effect. And then this side is just sort of looking at, we built in Ontario almost 80,000 units. I think this was 2011 to 2016. So we built almost 80,000 units, but the growth in the CMHC survey universe only went up by 45,000. So we can deduct that around about 33,000, so about a third, just over a third, 40% of the units were actually demolished. It's sort of a proxy for that. How many units are we losing as a result of intensification? So just by summary, what this tells us, and what I think some of the implications are, is that we haven't had a chronic long-term supply problem, but we now are creating one by virtue of very high levels of immigration. And I'm not suggesting we need to suppress immigration, but I think obviously we need it for labor market reasons. But I think we do need to think about the level of immigration and the number of temporary permits that are being issued. And try to better calibrate that with our ability to actually add to supply. As I mentioned, we've seen market response in terms of significant increase in rental development. And I should add that even though there is a significant initiative in the National Housing Strategy, the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, that's providing low-rate financing as an incentive to developers to build rental, that massive growth in private rental construction has very little to do with that particular program. 90% of those units did not take advantage of the RCFI program, which begs the question as to why we need that program in the first place. The expansion of owner investors is also adding supply, but in many cases we are seeing these folks that are buying the condos, they're really trying to cover their costs, so they are strongly incented to try and put the rents as high as they can. And in the face of this high demand and the fact that you've got these higher income individuals who can't get into home ownership are around and willing to pay those higher rents, they have actually been successful in achieving very, very high rents. The erosion issue I talked about is massively undermining our low-end stock, and it's basically creating challenges for low-income folks who, for whatever reason, have to move or lose their unit, and the unit they're moving to has already gone to the market because of vacancy decontrol and they can't afford it. And clearly, this is a contributing factor to growing encampments and homelessness. I think traditionally we've seen homelessness largely being a consequence of mental health and addictions issues. I think increasingly today, the increasing numbers of homeless are associated with absolute affordability problems and inability to find a place they can live. There's an article in the Globe and Mail this morning or yesterday morning about a woman, a nurse working in the hospital in Halifax, was evicted because somebody wanted the home for their own family, and is unable to find anything she could afford, has a salary of $50,000 a year, and she's living in a van. And I think that's the kind of evidence we're seeing of the impact of these kind of things. And so I come back to the earlier question, it's unclear whether the small scale investors are helping or hindering. They are adding supply, not necessarily affordable supply, but supply nonetheless. And I think to some extent, whether we need to introduce the policy remedies that Tsahai and Jeremy spoke about, versus whether we actually let the market to self-correct. Because these folks that purchased on the basis of significant appreciation, they've just seen depreciation of their assets. They're faced with increased mortgage payments, increased renewals if they're on a fixed rate, or increased mortgage payments if they're on a variable rate. Many of them will actually get into financial difficulty and have to bail. There may be some blood on the streets from these small investors. I don't think many of us would be too sympathetic, but it would have a positive impact if they flood the market with supply. That actually, again, there's a difference in supply between supply as in new building versus supply as in listings for sale. So if there's a massive flooding of listings for sale of condos, it would have a positive effect on reducing home prices. So just to finish up, the other sort of policy solutions I would put on the table, given the massive increase in international students and the demands they're having on the rental market, one way that CMHC could help to address this is to redirect some of their low rate financing from the RCFI, the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, to incent private developers to build purpose-built student housing, which actually pencils out as a very viable and profitable investment for private investors to do, and it would take the pressure off. If you've got 1,000 students or 1,000 beds of student housing that are built, that's 1,000 less students that are actually having an impact on the low-end stock in the local housing market. If you really want to affect the investor part of the market, I think rather than looking at tax or regulation, lending policy can be effective. And I think to some extent it already is. I mean, most of these folks that are buying multiple properties are subject to much more stringent underwriting, and they are required, they're allowed a much lower loan to value ratio on the purchase if they're actually going out taking a mortgage specifically on that property. If they do it indirectly and they remortgage their existing house to take and essentially buy cash and refinance later, that may work slightly differently. But I think we could actually have some effect if you wanted to, and that's a question I would beg, to stall that those purchasers. That's one way to look at it. And of course, related to that, I think the points that Jeremy was making, if we do want to enable these sort of pent-up first-time buyers to exit the rental market to create rental vacancies, then we need to create access to them, and removing some of the competition, the excessive sort of quality of competition they're competing against. It would be desirable, but we could also provide things like low rate financing to them and longer term amortization to help them get into the market, as long as you try and balance out. You don't want to create excess demand, but I don't think you would do by enabling them to get in, because they would be offset by the reduction in the investor purchases. And finally, as others have suggested, we need to, if these issues are arising because of severe market pressures, the more of the stock that we can reposition outside the influence of the market, the better. And the way to do that is basically expand the nonprofit sector, either by building new non-market, non-profit cooperative units, which tends to be quite expensive, or funding nonprofits to basically behave like the REITs and the large-scale institutional investors, help them buy some of these more moderate existing rental properties to preserve the rents that are still sitting less than the CMHC average market rent. And it's cheaper to build, to purchase those units than it is to build. There's less risk. You don't face NIMBY when you buy an existing building, and we could expand the scale and impact of the non-market sector by helping these folks to get into that particular market. So that's my contribution to the discussion.
Okay, thank you for that very comprehensive presentation, Steve. So we have one more presentation. It's my honor to invite Jessica Bell, MPP for University-Rosedale and the NDP critic for housing, to present to us. So Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you everyone else. I've been listening very intently and I've learned a lot. I really appreciate it. I'm the housing critic for the Ontario NDP. I've been the housing critic for 2 years, which means many of these bills that we're talking about, like Bill 23, the Conservative government's decision to drastically cut developer fees for developers, are bills that I've worked on extensively. I also see the impact of the housing crisis in my riding in particular. I represent University-Rosedale. It's the area that includes U of T. And like many of you, I walk down College Street and I see the encampments. We work with food bank providers. When I go door to door and knock on homes in big purpose-built rentals, I meet so many renters, students, seniors, families living in a 2-bedroom condo that they're renting, high income earners. And time and time and time again, I hear, I can't make it work in the city anymore. I cannot do it with inflation and the high cost of my rent. I am facing an illegal eviction. I'm facing an above guideline rent increase. I don't know what I'm going to do. It is the number one issue I hear at the door. And then again, I hear a lot, especially from those higher income earners, that feeling of anger and resentment that the ability to own a home is something that was available to their parents, to the generation before them. And they feel frustrated and angry that they're spending as much on rent now than previous people have spent on mortgages. And they don't understand and they do not like that they have been the dream of homeownership and the stability that it provides, the ability to provide for your family and save up for retirement and build equity has been taken from them. So there's a very real frustration and anger out there. I want to spend my time because I've listened to the other presenters and they've provided such an insightful, excellent analysis into what is happening. I want to focus on what is happening at Queen's Park to tackle housing affordability and this issue of speculation. I'm going to focus a little bit on what the Conservatives are doing, and then I'm going to focus on some of the areas that we are exploring, and then end with some, questions, unanswered questions that we have right now. And I really hope that afterwards people follow up with me or ask questions or provide me with evidence to really help us drill those through. So people are spot on. The Conservatives' approach to solving the housing crisis is to look at it as a supply issue and a supply issue only. I rarely hear the Minister for Municipal Affairs and Housing talk about affordability. He talks about supply. And they have passed law after law to make it much easier to build supply. They've given developers developer fee discounts, big developer fee breaks, which has led to municipalities being in a very, in a situation where they're not sure they're going to be able to provide the infrastructure that's needed. And we are seeing property tax hikes across the GTHA and beyond in the range of 2 to 7%. To make up that loss in revenue. We're also seeing the government eliminate rent control on units that were first occupied after 2018. We are seeing them also make it far easier for developers to build on farmland, to build single family homes. In the latest moves that they've just done, they've eliminated all density and intensification requirements that municipalities need to meet in their own boundaries, and also if they're opening up new land for development, which is deeply concerning. We take a different approach to how we want to solve the housing crisis and the speculation issue. And I'm very pleased that we're having a conversation now around speculation, because it is an issue that doesn't get as much attention as it needs to get. And it should. So I want to talk briefly about the four policy planks we have when we're talking about solving the housing crisis. And our goal is to ensure that everyone lives in a good home they can afford. That is our goal. And the four ways we see as addressing that is, number one, we do have a housing supply shortage, especially when we look at the federal government's future immigration targets, and the fact that a large percentage of new immigrants end up in the GTHA and in Ontario. We agree. We understand that there is some healthy debate over how many homes we need to build. We have landed on the 1.5 million homes in 10 years target, but Steve, I listened very carefully to what you and other people are saying around, making sure that we drill deep and get those numbers right. But we also want to make sure that we're building homes for Ontarians and not just investors, and that we're building homes in areas that is already zoned for development. I'm not going to spend a lot of time into what our policy pieces are there, because I really want to get to the pieces that are focused on speculation to focus on the topic in this presentation. So I'm going to get to our other 3 points. The second one is that it is pretty clear that the private market is not going to meet the affordability crisis that we are facing right now, and that we will need government investment to provide the affordable homes and the supportive homes that we need. After speaking to stakeholders, and assessing the need, our target is to build 250,000 homes over the next decade that are non-market, affordable, or supportive. And for us, that looks like moving forward with establishing a public builder that can build homes at cost on public land. We think it is a very effective model. We've seen it in other cities and countries. We have ample provincial and city and federal land available in areas that are close to services. And we see this as a way of building both market rate homes and affordable homes on public land. We also see a lot of value in incentivizing nonprofits and co-ops to build to build homes as well. We work pretty closely with the co-op housing sector and nonprofit developers, and allowing them more opportunity to build. We're essentially not building co-ops right now in Ontario is pretty important. So giving them access to financing, it's very hard for them to get the kind of financing they need, especially in this high rate interest rate environment we have. And also moving forward with approaches like offering them the right to build on public land and giving them the right of first refusal makes a lot of sense. And then we're also looking, when we're talking about building government housing, affordable housing, we're very interested in moving forward with inclusionary zoning, which means that any new development that is built, there's a percentage of homes that are affordable. The City of Toronto, many of you probably know this, spent many years developing a fair enough inclusionary zoning policy that would move forward with having developers build, a percentage of homes on buildings that were 100 units or more. Unfortunately, the Conservative government has made the decision to really hamper, they're refusing to allow the City of Toronto to implement their inclusionary zoning law, which is a massive lost opportunity, because developers are moving in and getting their applications in so that they can avoid abiding by it when it comes in. But we're pushing very hard to get that inclusionary zoning law approved as quickly as possible. So that's the government investment piece. And then there's two more. The big one I spent a lot of time on is making renting safe and affordable. And that's really where we talk about speculation as well. Because at the end of the day, investors are making money off renters. That's where their profit margin comes from, and selling off the house after as well. But it's putting people in a very difficult situation where they're paying off someone else's mortgage when they'd rather be paying off their own mortgage. And I think a lot of people want that to change, and so do I. There are a lot of things that we can do federally. There are some things we can do municipally. I'm going to focus on the provincial angle because that's my area of jurisdiction. And in my view, and from what I've learned, one of the most effective ways that we can really clamp down on investor-led speculation and make renting more safe and affordable is to bring in vacancy control and rent control on all units, so that there's a cap on the amount of rent on how much the landlord can raise the rent between tenancies, so that the incentive to evict is curbed, and the amount of money that an investor or a landlord can make off a renter is curbed as well. And the second piece that I believe is also very critical is that we really need to get tougher on maintenance. We are seeing many individuals who are living in buildings that are steadily falling into a state of disrepair because their landlord or the corporate landlord is just, they don't want to spend the money on maintenance. Their goal is to sell it off, demolish it, turn it into a condo when the opportunity arises. And they're not providing the necessary investment to keep that building in a state of good repair. And it's making people's lives really miserable. When I look at the landlord and tenant board, it is not a place that renters go to seek redress. You have to wait upwards of 2 years to get a hearing. And there's not a chance that a renter is going to wait 2 years to get their oven fixed or their washroom working. It's just not going to happen. So we've been long calling for a much tougher rental housing enforcement unit. It's a provincial body. And what should happen is that a renter can call this body, a bylaw officer answers that phone and does an investigation and issues fines or does what needs to be done to get that maintenance completed so a renter can live in a safe and affordable home. And when we help renters, we also we stabilize the housing market, because we stabilize rent and we ensure that landlords are spending the appropriate amount of money on maintenance. And then the final thing is around directly curbing speculation. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments after I share what we are doing so far on this. In the last election, we had, I would say, a modest approach to curbing speculation. We looked at real estate transparency, so that it was any person or corporation that bought a property, they needed to make the human owner of that property public. It needed to be part of a database that was publicly accessible. And the reason for this is that we really wanted to crack down on money laundering and tax avoidance that is taking place in the real estate sector by making it impossible for anonymous landlords, for anonymous corporations, for numbered corporations to buy property and keep the identity of the individuals buying that property secret. We were in support, and we continue to be in support of allowing municipalities to have a progressive property tax system, so that properties that are of higher value would pay a proportionately higher property tax. And we did move forward with implementing a 2% or advocating for a 2% non-resident speculation tax on homes owned by people who lived outside the province or who weren't paying their fair share of taxes outside the province. And then finally, a very pernicious issue we see in University-Rosedale, and it's actually across the GTHA, is we have many illegal short-term rentals. Our last calculation was there's over 30,000 properties, investor properties, that are still operating on the short-term rental market. And they're getting around the loopholes by saying that these properties are being rented out for 28 days or more, so they don't have to abide by municipal laws. And the challenge we're seeing there, and this is very anecdotal, is that people who are moving into these short-term rentals, they're not always tourists anymore. They're people who can't get into the long-term rental market. So they're renting these short-term rentals for a period of time, 6 weeks, 2 months, in the hope that they're going to find something longer. And these short-term rentals are astronomical in price. I'm not finding that the provincial government or the City of Toronto has taken this issue seriously. And I do see it contributing to the issue of speculation. Now, I want to conclude with the area that we are exploring. There is a very clear need, looking at the latest data coming out of Statistics Canada, to really target speculation and investor-led speculation that is being led by domestic investors, domestic landlords who own 2, 3, or 4 properties. I'm interested in seeing what are some measures that we can, propose now and move forward on that really, curb the amount of domestic speculation that we have in order to allow those renters to move into the first time, those first time home buyers who are renters to buy their home. That's what we want. It's a good idea. It's everyone's dream, and it makes a lot of sense. So that's my summary. That's my 4 points. I look forward to your questions and comments. I love hearing from experts, stakeholders, people who are interested in this issue. Please reach out to me. I'll put my contact information in the chat, and I look forward to hearing more from you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. We've heard now these 4 presentations, and in each case, we've heard a number of different policy recommendations. And I think that there's some really, really excellent ideas in all 4. And there's lots of overlap as well, although there's some distinctions. It's time now for our Q&A. So the audience can ask questions of our panelists, and our panelists can respond. We have roughly 19 minutes for this, so we don't have a ton of time, but it should be enough time for the Q&A. To start things off, I'll actually ask a question of each of the panelists. We've heard from Steve in his presentation that some of the so-called multi-property investors have been, providing rental housing through their purchases of condos. We also know that from Steve and Jeremy and everyone, that many of these investors, they might be jumping into the rental market to provide rental housing on a long-term basis, or maybe on an Airbnb or something. But many are also capitalizing on the change in capital gains. So there's a different kind of speculation there, you might say, right? So there's the multiple property owners who are jumping in because 2 years from now they're going to sell it for 50% more or whatever. And instead of those who are actually creating a business that is based on providing rental housing. And I wonder if each of you could comment briefly on what you think a policy or the best policy would be to curb that first kind of speculation, so that we get, as Steve mentioned, getting the right kind of behavior instead of the wrong kind of behavior. Those who are interested in jumping in and buying it whatever they can, maybe at the top of the market, paying the most they can because they think it's going to increase in value, will automatically bid more and cause increases in prices. And then everyone else who might want to provide rental housing has to pay that high cost and then charge a higher rent in order to cover their costs. And so there's that pernicious type of speculation. And so each of you have mentioned different policies. I wonder, for the benefit of our Q&A, to start this thing off, what policy you would recommend be implemented to curb that speculation for capital gains kind of speculation, so that when investors are buying a rental unit to rent out, they're buying at a price that is supported by the costs of the rent. So it's a question I had listening to all 4 presentations, which I think some other people in the chat also kind of alluded to in different kinds of ways. And then please, audience, please put your questions in the chat, and each of the panelists will answer them. So maybe we can start at the beginning. Tsahai, maybe you want to go first and see what you think, and we can then go through. And then by then we'll have like a whole bunch of audience questions that we can cycle through.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to the other panelists and all the presentations and great work that's been done with some more of the data and policies that are currently being enacted. I'm not sure I'll have the most robust answer to this particular question. What I do see as some solutions are obviously capital gains taxes, looking at vacant home policies and really cracking down on that. To what extent that is helpful by itself, it's hard to tell, but closing up some areas and ensuring that profit incentives in the short term are not what are allowed to drive housing investment, housing purchases, and housing prices overall.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I love the general answer. I mean, that's exactly what we need. Jeremy, what do you think on this question and maybe other questions that are related?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tsahai, and I think that to an extent, like the distinction between someone who's buying an investment property to rent out short term because they plan to flip it quickly versus someone who's planning to rent it a long term, it's a difficult distinction to make. And I think there are a few policies that are being discussed in many provinces. Some provinces are putting them in place to specifically address like flipping and the velocity with which units say if you sell it within a certain period of time, you are subject to a higher tax. I think that's one reason these policies are coming into play. I mean, big picture, I think everyone in the chat, well, a lot of people in the chat kind of beat us all to the punch, saying, and going with what Jessica Bell has said, which is vacancy control is a way to make these units treated not as kind of something where you can just kick out a renter, find a way to kick out these renters as soon as you realize that it's possible to get a higher rent. I think vacancy control is just an important way to have these units be much more stable, but also just having more purpose-built rental housing. There's a reason that type of those types of units are just more secure tenure, and obviously if they were owned and operated by non-profit oriented entities, they're going to be all the more so.
Okay, yes, thank you. Steve, maybe you can answer this and feel free to comment on other aspects of the question as well.
Yeah, as Jeremy has indicated, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that vacancy decontrol is what has allowed rents to go up at these double-digit 20% increases. If we want to dissuade investment, you have rental properties didn't used to be an attractive asset class. They've become an attractive asset class in the last 10 or 15 years, mainly because of the mechanism of vacancy decontrol. And so I think make them less attractive. It does become an enforcement issue. We have to go back to what we did before 1998, and all properties would be registered with in a rent registry, and the rents could only be increased regardless of whether the units changed hands. So I think that was it certainly would be the single most effective thing that we could do. On the tax side, I think you could look at some kind of a variable capital gains tax, depending on the duration of the hold. Maybe if it's sold within 24 months or something like that, it's a 75% capital gain rather than a 50% capital gain for the inclusion rate that we currently have, or we could, I mean, one of the things that always really bothered me about land transfer tax, which is applied at the provincial level, is we apply the land transfer tax to the poor purchaser. Many of these first-time buyers can hardly afford to buy the house, let alone give the government another 1.5–2% to cover the land transfer tax. Yet the vendor of that property is running away with bags of money. Could we actually move the land transfer tax from the purchaser to the vendor? And in the case of a vendor that's sold in a short period of time, have a higher rate of land transfer tax to dissuade short-term flipping.
Okay, thanks. And Jessica, please feel free to jump in on this.
Yeah, my job is just to listen. I really like what the Steve and Jeremy and Tsahai have said about this issue. I have and I have no other exciting, policy tips to add aside from the wise ideas that have already been presented.
So one of the questions that has been posed and discussed in the chat while we were, hearing from all of you, is the issue of Airbnb and how Airbnb in the short-term rental market is kind of an escape valve for investors, and whether or not there's some way that those can be regulated in addition to the ways that we've already attempted to do so, that would mean that more of that stock would be on the long-term market. So there's a kind of question there. So maybe we could, each of you could comment on that question as well.
If you don't mind, I can start with that question. We have been working extensively on the short-term rental issue. I've been working with Torben, who works at Fairbnb, as well as some city councillors who work at the City of Toronto and who are concerned, like me, that the City of Toronto's new short-term rental law is not being enforced. Quite honestly, it's pathetic, and it needs to be significantly changed. What I'm also seeing when I canvass twice a week, so I have a pretty good understanding of what's going on, at least in downtown Toronto. Many of the big purpose-built rentals that are being established right now have whole floors dedicated to short-term rentals. Dell Suites, Tridel, the big purpose-built rentals on Gerrard, whole suites. And you can go online and book them. And they, there's all these, you've got to sign all these waivers, et cetera, and you sign on for 28 days or more. You can sign on for a few months. And so there are small-time investors, and then there are also big corporate investors that are turning to the short-term rental market, and they're taking advantage of this loophole, which is that the City of Toronto only regulates short-term rentals that are 28 days or less. So they're saying, hey, we don't even need to register with the City of Toronto's rule. And then the Residential Tenancies Act on paper is meant to regulate these short-term rentals, 28 days or more, so that renters who move in have rights, including that only the Landlord-Tenant Board can evict them. However, no one is enforcing the Residential Tenancies Act rules. We've asked the Minister to do it. We've asked the police to do it. We've asked the Rental Housing Enforcement Unit to do it. We've gone to the media when we identify these outrageous examples. It's not being done. So there's a few things we're pushing for. One, we want the City of Toronto to get serious about enforcing their short-term rental rule. And if they're finding that there's a gap where people are taking advantage of the 28-day, standard by going a little bit beyond it, then, close that loophole ASAP and get tougher about enforcement. The second thing is strengthening the Rental Housing Enforcement Unit, which is, it's a bunch of I don't know how many people, 10 people with a number that's never answered, to make it far stronger, put more money into it so that there's bylaw officers that can respond quickly. So that, if you think that there's an illegal short-term rental on your street, you should be able to call the Rental Housing Enforcement Unit and have them investigate. Because if we start getting serious about it, then people are going to understand that they can't get away with having an illegal short-term rental anymore, and they are going to return that unit to the long-term rental market and increase our long-term rental supply.
Jessica's kind of highlighted a real vexing problem here as well. I mean, regulation can be great. It's the enforcement of regulation that's really challenging. And so, how do you actually enforce these things? And we can hire a bunch of bylaw officers, but it is a real challenge to do. So that's why I think, regulation, we have to be wary about how much we try to regulate, because can we actually make it effective? I sat in a conference in Barcelona last summer, the European Network for Housing Research, and they were talking about the Airbnb issue in Barcelona, in Munich, in Edinburgh. It's a pervasive global phenomenon, and no one has figured out how to tamp it down, sadly.
Yeah, thanks for those contributions. Tsahai, Jeremy?
I don't think there's too much to add to that. I think that captures the heart of the issue. I guess what I would say is that this is where it becomes interesting again to look at other models of housing, increasing cooperatives, increasing access to publicly funded, socially owned models of housing. Regulation can be hard to enforce. So ensuring that people have access to other housing options that are not affected, not driven by these for-profit solutions could be really important. It's not going to replace all of our housing anytime soon. It won't be easy to build, but even just beginning to build that capacity and build that supply could begin making a big difference for people who are looking for long-term affordable housing.
Yeah, thank you. I think we agree. Jeremy, go ahead.
Oh, there's really not much to add to that. like comprehensive answer that we got from Jessica, though. This is a type of rental housing which is finding a way to evade our already not particularly robust rental protections that exist, and that's clearly to the detriment of the entire city. And so yes, I think that the work that Airbnb and Torben is doing is something that's really worth keeping up with, and I'm really glad that Jessica was being able to champion that.
Okay, thanks. So there's one question here that I think might be also relevant to everybody's expertise, although it's looking at the federal government. But the question is basically, is there anything that the federal government is doing that you think has been positive or could be positive to help with the building of more affordable housing? So it's like, is there anything that's going on that you think is really great? Now this is directed at the federal level, but I think feel free to highlight provincial or municipal policies that you think would be really useful here. Who wants to start?
I mean, the question just asks, is there anything they can do in the GTA? I mean, as someone from outside the GTA and someone that analyzes the allocation of federal funds across the country, GTA gets far more than its fair share of federal dollars currently, partly because you have both the minister and the parliamentary assistant, both the current one and the previous ones being from Toronto, and that seems to apply an awful lot of political pressure, that there is massive distortion in terms of the allocation of federal funds to Toronto. So you're getting lots already. That said, the problem there is massive. The problem everywhere is massive, but building our way out of this, as much as it would be great to have a Vienna type 60% of housing is social housing, these days we're needing to spend at least $300,000 to $350,000 a door in deep capital subsidy to get even moderate rents of around about 80% of average market rent. So it's a very, very serious challenge to build our way out of the problem. I think what we saw in the 2021 census data, in terms of core housing need, we haven't moved the needle on core housing needs since it was invented in 1985. All of a sudden, despite all of the things we've just been talking about the massive increase in rents and the increasing levels of unaffordability, core housing need in this country declined by 242,000 households between 2016 and 2021. Was that because we did a whole bunch of new building of housing? No, it's because we had CERB benefits in 2020, and the census question asked what was your income last year, and it compared it to your rent, and you weren't paying more than 30% of your income anymore. What that proved was that a realistic housing benefit of $400 or $500 a month could help people actually pay the rent where they're currently living. If we can help people stay in the house they're currently living in and not get evicted, not only does it help them, it stops that house being subject to vacancy decontrol and actually contributing to rent inflation. So I think looking on the demand side at housing allowances is probably the single most effective, quickest way to address serious renter affordability issues.
Okay, who else would like to jump in on this? So we've heard that the CERB was really helpful, and any kind of housing allowance might be useful. Anything else that is already happening that you think could be scaled up or could be a model to apply to other places in addition to the Vienna one? Okay, go ahead, Jessica.
My hands are full with complete and totally preoccupied with Doug Ford and the Conservatives and what they're doing. So I got to say, I don't focus a lot on the federal government. However, I want to give an example. In the middle of the pandemic, there was a lot of money available for homelessness prevention and keeping people housed. That was coming from the federal government. And in our riding, a decision was made to buy an existing retirement home that had been, all the tenants had moved out. It was complicated, but it was empty at the time that it was built. And it was a solid, I think it was over 100 units. It was near services. It was near Bloor and Young. It was well made. And the federal government made the decision to purchase that home outright and move individuals in that needed supportive housing. It's primarily become a supportive housing building.
Yeah.
And that idea of buying up existing properties in that are fairly well made in areas that have the services that are needed for the people who are moving in is a very effective way to quickly tackle the homelessness crisis and the affordable housing crisis we have for very low and low income people. Is it going to solve the crisis and we don't do anything else? No, of course not. But it's a very quick way to immediately create new housing units that are more affordable for people. It should be replicated.
That was a bit of a one-off because I've been banging on CMHC and the minister's door for the last 4 years on a federal funded acquisition program to help nonprofits buy existing properties. And they assert that they don't have cabinet authority to do acquisition. They can only build new social or they can retrofit existing social housing. So if it was a non-residential building, which that one probably was considered, then they did it. But generally speaking, they currently can't do it, and we're trying to get some cabinet authority to change CMHC's role to do that kind of stuff.
We should talk offline because it was a residential building. So let's chat.
Yeah, maybe because it was the homeless money rather than CMHC money, probably.
Yeah, it was something.
Yeah.
It was nice.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for that discussion. So we're basically at time. I want to give Tsahai and Jeremy the opportunity, if you have something that you wanted to mention or something that you want as a model or anything else that you wanted to say, the opportunity to complete this discussion. So please, Tsahai, did you have anything you wanted to add to this discussion?
Yeah, I'll add something quickly. I guess I could say generally what I'm happy to see is just more action being taken. It's unfortunate that the housing situation got to this point, but we do see a lot of municipalities across the country taking different actions to try and experiment and start seeing, and we can use that to learn what we can do better and what will work. One thing that I find interesting is looking just for our neighbors in Manitoba, where rent control is a little bit more expanded than what we see in Ontario and somewhat tied to units. Rent prices haven't jumped as much there, but also there's a lot of other factors considering the differences between the provinces that will have a lot of effects, but it is something that we can look to, something that's already implemented and working at least to some degree.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Jeremy, one last comment before we close the session.
Sure, yeah, no, so Steve's absolutely right that if you give people who are struggling to pay their rent more money, they will you're going to see results that people are able to pay their rent or are putting less of their income towards rent. I think one of the concerns of just working on a demand side policy like that is that landlords will also eventually enjoy the ability to raise rents higher, which is something that we're all very aware of, and which is one of the reasons this question about acquisition policies and taking more private existing relatively affordable housing off of the market before it's repositioned. And I look to what's happening in BC with a lot of excitement around this. It was in January that the NDP government there announced that they were having a $500 million acquisition fund for that exact purpose. They're not messing around doing a million consultations around it. Apparently it's going to be launched in about a month. They've just hired the head of it, and it's going to get going. So, that's the kind of gumption and the kind of resources that are needed to get going on this. And I know we're meant to wrap up. I'm so interested by what Steve just said in terms of what it would take to get the federal government to also beef up their own program around that. You're saying that they don't have that they're saying that they don't even have the authority to do that. Maybe I've misunderstood you. Is it possible just to kind of quickly clarify what it would take for the federal government to do, to add on to what BC just did there?
Yeah, basically all you have to do is write a cabinet submission, get cabinet to direct CMHC to use their lending facility and contributions facility to include acquisition. It's not a big problem. Easy to do, just needs a cap doc.
Great.
So we have lots of great ideas. And we've heard that this is actually easy to do, which would be wonderful if we could direct the federal government, which of course has the most resources, to acquire, buildings, take them off the market, make them into some kind of non-market form of housing. That seems like one of the many solutions that we've talked about that would be really helpful here. Maybe looking to Manitoba, looking to some of the other things that have occurred in our own province and other provinces. So let's wrap up this session. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. I think we've learned a lot. And let's continue this discussion. I think we have another panel that is coming up in June. And so let's reconvene at that panel. And please join me, everyone, in thanking our panelists for a wonderful panel.
Great.
So see you, everybody. Have a great evening. Thanks again. And we'll catch you at the next panel.